East meets West.
Richard Nixon's historic visit helped open that vast nation to the West. Some now see China as a sprawling new market for American business. But with the collapse of the Soviet Union, China is also the only remaining nation on Earth that could contend with the U.S. for the title of superpower. A recent incident involving an American spy plane added to existing tensions on a range of issues, including human rights and protection for intellectual property.
This is an incident caused totally by the American side.
We have said that the plane should not be violated. It is protected in our judgment from that kind of intrusion.
What does the future hold for America and China? And what must we do to avoid a new Cold War? Jeff, let's start with that incident and put it in the context of whether we're beginning to see a new Cold War as a result of the spy plane incident, or maybe just a continuation of the old, or neither of the above.
Well, I think in one sense we've been in a process of a new Cold War, or a continuation of the last Cold War, at one level in Chinese and American relations, which is the tendency of each side to demonize the other when a moment of conflict comes up, very much the way that the Soviet Union and the United States used to demonize each other. And we've seen this ratchet up very quickly in the case of this spy plane incident. In a sense, we become a convenient enemy for the other, and then this gets inflected with domestic politics and arguments. In another way, though, the post-Cold War setting is a very different geopolitical one, and I think that's something we still need to come to terms with in terms of dealing with crises like this as they come up, and we haven't done a very good job so far.
Scott, how important is this issue? Is it just a little bump in the road, or is it something that the Bush administration will have to take into account seriously for the next 4 or 8 years?
They're going to have to take account of this seriously because it comes at the beginning of the administration, but it comes after, as Jeff was saying, a whole series of incidents over the last decade since the Tiananmen Square protests, where each side has seen each other in the most negative terms. There's a range of opinions in both countries about the need for cooperation versus the need to take the other side warily, and this bodes more toward seeing the other in the worst light. If they're able to get by this in relatively short amount of time, it could actually help cooperation because it makes each side focus on the other and find out what's really important. The longer it drags out and isn't resolved, the more likely it will be much more than a bump in the road and will be a big pothole.
John, what are the politics of this? The American politics are complicated, but so are the Chinese politics.
I think the Chinese politics is complicated by this incident. I think the issue of nationalism is always there in China, especially during this period of time when China is trying its hardest to become a very powerful, at least economically powerful nation. And during this particular period of time, when something happens like this, will really anger the Chinese. That's what I understand.
Alan, we've been over the last 8 dozen years working very hard to open up our business relationships with China. Does this incident or some of the other ones that Scott mentioned really get in the way of that?
Well, I hope not. I think that we have to keep this incident in perspective. I think in the long term, unlike Scott, it's not all that important. I think that the United States and Canada have been building a deep economic relationship, which is an aspect of the globalization of business. There's a tremendous amount of U.S. and other Western foreign direct investment in China, a lot of joint ventures, quite close economic ties. And of course the Chinese are promoting this through a unique system of market socialism. So I suspect that in the long run, this incident will just mark the beginning of the Bush administration and not affect the ongoing U.S.-Chinese relationship.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the conflict between political and geopolitical competition and the desire to cooperate in terms of a business arrangement. Can we do both simultaneously, or do we have to solve the geopolitical one first?
Well, I think one of the things is to notice how these two are intertwined. And for example, I think that the intertwining within China is the Chinese Communist Party has essentially two cards left to play. Lots of people view them as corrupt within the country. Lots of people are dissatisfied with the Communist Party in many ways. But the Communist Party can say, in effect, look, the world is a dangerous place, so we need a strong government in place. And the other thing they can do is say, look, we brought high growth rates. They need to somehow keep fulfilling these two promises. And in an odd way, when an incident like this happens, it strengthens the Chinese Communist Party by allowing it to say, see how dangerous the world is. If we don't stay strong, we could be taken advantage of. And here, the counterexample that they trot before the people continually is what happened in Russia, which has simultaneously been economically weakened and been, to their point of view, taken advantage of by the outside world since the fall of the Communist Party there.
I would like to add to the issue of human rights in China. In this country, we actually watch very closely how human rights is violated in China. But from a Chinese perspective, the government of China is calling for more of a survival rights. They think that what the survival right is more important than human rights. By saying that survival right, they mean that they should have the right to allow this country to develop, to have the possibility to allow people to have enough food and to have raise their living standard. They think that's more important than human rights. That is why we have so many misunderstandings between us, because we kind of like judge them from our perspective and they judge from their perspective. And this problem with the perspective is really where the core of the problem lies between the relationship of two countries.
Yeah, but we shouldn't get overly concerned and think that a new Cold War, or the continuation of the one from through the 80s is going to continue. There's a lot of places where our interests overlap and converge, and it's to have a new Cold War requires China to both have the capabilities and the intent to have a conflict with us. And I think on the military side, their capabilities certainly don't come anywhere close to matching ours. And on the intent side, I think it's still an open question. And I think that China can be a rising power and still be consistent with what we want in the region and globally. It doesn't have to become a long-term, drawn-out struggle on human rights, on trade, on security matters. These are things that are negotiable for the most part.
Yeah. So could I just say that I think that the incident is useful because it does highlight a difference in the institutional structure of the United States and China. If we take an economic issue, the Chinese for 15 years have wanted to join the GATT, now the World Trade Organization. The United States Congress has approved entry. The European Union has approved entry. Why isn't China in the World Trade Organization? And the answer, of course, is that despite the endorsement of these two economic superpowers, Europe and the United States, the Chinese have been slow to bring their institutions in line with those that are required to be a member of this trade club. So at the moment, China could join the WTO if they would reform their domestic institutions to respect the rule of law, to respect national treatment for foreign direct investment. So I think this incident is quite useful because it shows that the Chinese really want to do both things. They want to be players in the global economy, and yet they're still extremely nationalistic and, in a way, isolationist in their viewpoint about how important they see China.
It goes back to John's key point that there really is that conflict between wanting to be a player in the world and the remnants of a strong nationalism.
I think if we judge them from the perspective of what this should be, I think we have a problem because we think that China is slow moving into the right direction, or we should say that they're still not up to the standard of what we expect them to be. But if we look the history of China and we see how much improvement they have made, the Chinese government has done quite a good job. For example, my recent trip to China assured me that what the Chinese government is doing, they have actually put all kinds of things like laws and all the regulations into place, although they still have not had the chance to really use them in reality, but they are trying very hard. And what's interesting to me is that when I look at those things, new regulation laws that they put into place, they look very much similar to the American laws and regulations in business. And I think that if we look at history, I would say that they made a great improvement.
But we
John,
keep hearing in the American press about human rights violations, violations of religious freedom, for example. Maybe the laws that are being put in place aren't enacted fully, implemented, or maybe the U.S. press is misreporting it, or both.
I think,
go ahead,
it's
Scott.
on the question of human rights. Your standard for where China is depends on your time frame. Most of the American media and China watchers from here make a comparison based between today and say 5-6 years ago. And on that standard, China's regressing on political prisoners and religion. But if you look at the longer term perspective, which I think is what Xinjiang is doing, over the past, compared to 20 years ago or 30 years ago, there's much greater freedom in China today, at least personal freedom. The primary thing that the Chinese government's focusing on is organized opposition, and that's where most of their energy is focused, and so that's what receives most of the attention today.
Well, what I was going to say is just in this long-term perspective, one major difference is that now in China you're quite free to be apolitical. In other words, if you don't join one of the banned religious groups, if you keep quiet, then you're to a large degree left alone and have a great deal of personal freedom. At the worst period of the Maoist era, simply by who you were, the family you belonged to, your class lineage and stuff, you could be imprisoned and in trouble because of that. Whereas now it's largely, at least, and I think this is a big step forward, because the government thinks that you've said or done something, that the weight of the state comes down upon you.
Still sounds a long way to go. Alan, do you want to?
Well, let me try and frame it in this way. The incident about the spy plane is very interesting because the standoff largely comes, as I see it, because the Chinese are saying their sovereignty has been infringed. And now there's this difficulty in making a face-saving exit for both sides. But the problem is, if we relate this in an economic context, the Chinese concern about sovereignty is in opposition to their obligations that they will need to make to join the international economic community. So when I say, John, that it's been slow for China to adapt its institutions to join the World Trade Organization, technically this is because countries which join have 5 years to comply with the requirements of this club. The Chinese are basically negotiating now in Geneva to say, well, we need longer than 5 years to change our institutions. Now this, I think, is a problem because the Chinese are saying, on the one hand, we want the benefits of free trade, we want foreign investment, we want access to other markets, we want more jobs and growth. On the other hand, they're saying, we want to do it on our terms. Like, China's a special place, we have a history, we have a culture, and we're very reluctant to adapt to the worldview. Now John said we shouldn't impose our views on them, which I agree. But if you want to join a club of international traders, you have to play by the rules of the club. And this is, I think, where the tension is in the long run.
But what I really think our problem is that we expect them too much and too fast. And the other thing is about human rights, for example. Let me come back to this religious freedom issue. I think the Chinese government has offered much more freedom to the religious groups than any period of time in since 1949. However, they do still have this problem of control. They still have this issue of control. They do not want the foreigners to do too much in China in terms of having all these missionary
but
groups
John,
and all of that.
You're saying we shouldn't do too much too fast. I mean, 5 years, 10 years, I mean, how long will it take until China decides that it wants to adapt its institutions technically to meet the World Trade Organization criteria? I mean, other countries have done this. India's done it. Brazil's done it. I mean, why can't China? Why is China a special case so that we have to change the rules for China?
Well, if you look at China began its negotiations to join the WTO in 1986, and over the course of the past 15 years, even prior to joining the WTO, they've made a lot of market opening measures. Certainly, it does not fulfill the requirements today that there are to join the WTO, but if you compare China at its economic level today to where Japan was at its economic level, China is much more open than Japan was at the same stage of development, and at that time Japan was a member of the WTO. Joining the WTO is a basic requirement that all countries maintain the course of the negotiations, China has already made a lot of compromises. The U.S. and the other members of the WTO have basically set a pretty high barrier, and at least on paper, China has made a lot of promises. I think I agree with you. When it comes time to implementation, it will be extremely difficult. It will be a long process and continually contentious.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's almost a matter of philosophy, isn't it? Let's just take the most basic point about doing business in another country. The technical provision of the World Trade Organization and NAFTA or any agreement is the principle of national treatment. It says, when I put my investment in your economy, my businesses are to be treated in the same way as domestic businesses. You get national treatment. You get equal application of the law. That's what the U.S. Did with Canada in the Free Trade Agreement. It's what happens with Mexico in NAFTA. It's what all countries have in the World Trade Organization. The basic problem is, I think, that the Chinese don't accept the principle of national treatment. They want to have special conditions about foreign investment.
Let me jump in and take the other side of it, Alan, which is what the Chinese complain is that, in fact, they aren't being held by the same standards. And let's switch to the Olympics. Is another thing that's on the table, is whether Beijing can host the Olympics.
Olympics does have a lot to do with trade.
It has a lot to do with trade. It has a lot to do with being accepted in the club of nations.
Right.
In 1988, South Korea was allowed to host the Olympic Games. In 1980, the government had carried out the Gwangju massacre, in which arguably more people died than in 1989 in China. This was a case of severe repression. South Korea was guilty of many of the same kinds of levels of human rights abuses in terms of crackdowns on dissent. And in the early 80s, it was granted, I'm not sure what the timetable was, the right to host the Olympics in 1988. China sees that. Chinese intellectuals know this history, and they see this as a special singling out of not being let into the club in the same way that other countries would be.
Let me interject a new element into the conversation. Let me interject a new element. We hear a lot about the military threats, particularly as they relate to Taiwan, and the question whether we can ever get to a sound relationship with China without resolving that. Is that resolvable, and how important is it in the general mix of things?
I think that's a real tough issue, is the relationship. Our relationship with Taiwan. China is watching this very closely. To them, Taiwan is an issue of nationalism again. It's the issue of national unity. And to them, it is a very important issue. And then I don't think any Chinese leader, even whoever it is, even if he thinks that he may relax a little bit on that, he would not do it because the whole nation will not agree on that thing. But from our perspective, we are in kind of a dilemma now. Is that we have a lot of moral obligations to Taiwan, as I understand. But on the other hand, we want to maintain this normal relationship with China, and this is some issue that can get us into mud, drag us into mud, because once China and Taiwan gets into big trouble, what do? Is the real big problem.
There's strong expectation will come to the defense of Taiwan and provide the weapons that are necessary. And clearly, this is going to be controversial.
This is by far the toughest nut to crack. And it's increasingly tough because of democratization in Taiwan. Prior to the election of the current president of Taiwan, both sides, both leaderships across the Taiwan Strait, both saw each other as Chinese and had their both models for reunification, but under different political formulas. Now that's not true, and as Taiwan continues to democratize and gains its own identity, it makes it tough. So this is not something which just the U.S. and the PRC can negotiate easy resolution to. It requires all sides to come to the table.
And the democratization of Taiwan also provides one very good thing, which is that it undermines any kind of Chinese argument that establishing free elections, establishing competitive parties somehow goes against any sort of Chinese tradition, because Taiwan has certainly been able to move to that after a large period of repression and martial law. And so it provides an opening, a possibility that way, the democratization in Taiwan.
I just wonder if there are any lessons that we could learn from Hong Kong. I mean, Hong Kong, I remember 10 years ago there was discussion about would there be any military involvement there, and here we are 3 or 4 years after Hong Kong. It's a part of China. The business system is quite strong. The democratic system is still there. I mean, perhaps there's some negotiable diplomatic way in which this can be resolved. I don't see that this is an issue which inevitably, Miles, has to be resolved by thinking of it in military terms. So, I mean, if the British could give up Hong Kong and, I mean...
But Taiwan and Hong Kong might not be the same. I mean,
I agree, but what's happened is that the systems merged, that the Hong Kong capitalist system has been backed into the Chinese communist systems, and I don't see why the Taiwanese success in a world economy can't now be absorbed by the Chinese. I mean, it would seem to me in the interest of China, the People's Republic doesn't have to really own Taiwan. I mean, it can get
you see some middle ground here?
It's still, it's already getting an enormous amount of investment. There's a large amount of economic money pouring in from Taiwan in the same way that there was money coming in from Hong Kong at an earlier period.
But how are the politics of Taiwan? At least that seems like a long way to go from here.
Well, I don't think we should worry too much about the rhetoric. I mean, there's obvious posturing for historical and cultural reasons, but I mean, if you believe in the economic drivers, I mean, we may even get a reverse takeover of the Taiwanese if they have all the money.
Well, whenever I hear about economic drivers, I think about Singapore, in which free markets doesn't seem to me have been very good at bringing about free political systems.
But by the way, I just want to get in one thing about the Olympics. Being a Canadian, I actually think Toronto would be a better site than Beijing.
Nationalism comes in all sorts of stripes.
I was born in Shanghai. I would say Shanghai is a better place for me.
Chang, I want to ask you about Taiwan. Do you think mainland China can accept some separation, independence of government, but yet a strong set of cross-economic ties? Would that be adequate for the mainland Chinese purposes?
I think the Chinese government feels strongly about the reunification issue. Not only they feel strongly, they think that is unnegotiable issue for them. That is where the problem lies, is that both sides, I mean, the mainland Chinese and the Taiwan people feel strongly about their own rights, in a sense. The mainland Chinese think that Taiwan belongs to China. They have to have a reunification. Now, let's look at this picture. If Taiwan, from a Chinese government perspective, that's what I mean, if Taiwan is allowed to be free or to be independent, then what about Tibet? What about Xinjiang and other places? We want to be independent too. Then what Chinese government is going to do? They're going to facing a real big tough issue of disintegrating
but what I heard, the country. Maybe there's a middle path governed by economic prosperity that the question of independence or not doesn't really enter into it anymore. If that's possible, do we need to wait for a whole new generation? Do we need to wait for
that? Probably, as I see it, that the possibility of that resolve this issue is in the time. I think that's the only way I think we might see some resolution to that issue.
But John, isn't it true that the younger generations, I mean by younger I mean the people in their 50s and 60s in China, are more open towards economic reform and trade liberalization and so on?
That is true. Hopefully that if people from both sides have all these economic relationships, then they will think more about how to become
But strong economic relations at least make people think 2 or 3 times before you undertake some military action.
Yeah, there's the McDonald's theory of peace, which, you know, there's tons of McDonald's throughout Taiwan, and there's a lot in Beijing, 60 in the capital alone. But you can have strong economic ties and be a fervent nationalist at the same time. And amongst the Chinese that I've met and interviewed, they carry around 2 images in their head. They want good relations with the U.S., with the international community. They're interested in going abroad, but they also see themselves as quite patriotic. And so these 2 things go with people all the time.
I mean, can I give a good news parallel? I mean, look at the trade relations and sovereignty between Canada and the United States. I mean, Canada actually has 4 times as much trade with the United States than the United States has with China. Canada's a bigger economy than China. We're not having a program about the problems with Canada. I mean, and it's largely because although Canadians are very nationalistic and see themselves with a clear identity, they benefit from the economic relations and the 50 or 100 years.
But we also don't routinely demonize the Canadians in our press.
Well, good, thank goodness.
Thank goodness, but this gets in the way. This is a moment of possibilities when a ratcheting down of the rhetoric of hostility toward a supposedly unchanging demonic China is very important to try to
I agree
try to
completely.
dampen down.
I think that there's some level of paranoia, I think.
On both sides. That
Yeah, on both sides,
reinforces-
right. What happens is in our country, we look at China as emergent superpower. We think that if China becomes too powerful in economic sense, that will be politically economic, then it will be military.
Well,
Powerful.
it's clear that we're going to have to find some way of reconciling the various approaches that China takes. China's here to stay. The United States will have to find a way to deal with China in the future, and the recent incidents notwithstanding. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Pro and Con is available for home video. To order your copy, write to WTIU or call Monday